One of the near-death experience cases Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross documented in her archives begins with an envelope received in Chicago in the winter of 1983. The envelope contained a medical report from Stuttgart's Municipal Children's Hospital in West Germany, accompanied by detailed notes on the psychological evaluation of an 8-year-old child who had been resuscitated following a brief but clinically significant cardiorespiratory arrest. The case would not have attracted immediate attention had it not been for a peculiar detail recorded by the psychologist in charge. Upon regaining full consciousness, the child began to recount vivid memories of having served as a British soldier in World War II, decades before his own birth. Dr. Kübler-Ross, already familiar with reports of out-of-body experiences and unexplained memories in resuscitated patients, classified the document as a priority and dedicated weeks to its careful analysis, searching for patterns that could be correlated with the thousands of cases already catalogued in her research on the nature of human consciousness in the face of clinical death. The patient, identified as Leon Matthias Gerber, was born on March 17, 1974, the son of Klaus Gerber, a civil engineer, and Miriam Gerber, a teacher of German literature. The family resided in a quiet residential area of Stuttgart, characterized by semi-detached houses with well-kept gardens and tree-lined streets where children played under attentive supervision. Leon was described by his parents as a delicate, observant child who was exceptionally sensitive to auditory stimuli, particularly flutes and drums. His emotional development followed entirely healthy patterns, with no known exposure to violent content or military narratives. The primary school teacher, later contacted by the medical team, recorded in her statement that Leon showed an unusual empathy for his age, often interrupting games to comfort crying classmates. On one memorable occasion, after witnessing a heated argument between two students on the playground, Leon commented a sentence to the teacher that she noted in her pedagogical diary. "When someone screams, the world becomes heavy." The Gerber family had no British, military, or historically significant connections. Klaus had briefly served in the German army during the conscription period in the 60s, but never spoke about military topics at home, considering them inappropriate for young children. The clinical event that would forever change the Gerber family's trajectory occurred on July 24, 1982. Leon was participating in a school camp organized by the primary school in the mountains near the Black Forest, a common recreational activity during the German summer. On the afternoon of that Saturday, under intense sun and an estimated temperature of 32 degrees Celsius, Leon began to show signs of discomfort during a guided hike. Witnesses reported that the child complained of a sudden and intense headache, followed by body stiffness and convulsive movements characteristic of a febrile epileptic seizure. The teacher in charge, trained in basic first aid, positioned Leon in the recovery position to prevent aspiration, while another educator rushed to the camp base to request medical assistance. During the convulsive movements, which, according to the teacher's wristwatch, lasted approximately 45 seconds, Leon completely lost consciousness. At the end of the seizure, the camp's nursing team, made up of 2 experienced nursing assistants, confirmed the absence of spontaneous breathing. The resuscitation protocol was immediately initiated, with mouth-to-mouth ventilation and chest compressions performed by one nurse while the other prepared the available emergency equipment. The duration of the cardiorespiratory arrest, meticulously documented in the subsequent medical report, was 1 minute and 20 seconds, until Leon showed the return of spontaneous breathing and a gradual recovery of consciousness. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes after the initial event, transporting the still unresponsive child to the Stuttgart Municipal Children's Hospital, where he was received by Dr. Andreas Falk, the pediatrician responsible for the pediatric emergency department. During hospital stabilization, Leon underwent preliminary neurological exams, which included assessing pupillary reflexes, muscle tone, and reaction to verbal stimuli. The electroencephalogram performed 3 hours after admission showed brain activity within the expected standards for recovery after a seizure, with no signs of permanent neurological damage. His body temperature, initially elevated to 39.5 degrees Celsius, was controlled with cold compresses and antipyretic medication appropriate for the patient's age and weight. Dr. Falk noted in the patient's record that Leon was exhibiting unusual behavior for a child who had just been stabilized after a convulsive event. He did not show the typical confusion or agitation of the postictal phase, but a deep, thoughtful silence, with a fixed gaze directed at indefinite points on the hospital room ceiling. The parents, who had been contacted immediately and arrived at the hospital 2 hours after admission, reported their strangeness at their son's composure, who would normally seek physical comfort after frightening experiences. Leon remained under neurological observation at the hospital for 48 hours, a period during which his physical recovery was complete and uncomplicated. On the morning of July 26th, during the routine visit of Dr. Ilse Brenner, the child psychologist responsible for the behavioral assessment of pediatric neurological cases, the extraordinary aspect of the case emerged for the first time. Dr. Brenner, a meticulous professional with 15 years of experience in developmental psychology, began her assessment with standard questions about Leon's emotional well-being and his understanding of the event he had experienced. The child responded with unusual clarity and coherence, demonstrating preserved memory of the moments before the seizure. When Dr. Brenner asked what Leon remembered about the moment he lost consciousness, the child's answer initiated an investigation that would last months and eventually cross borders to reach Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross's archives in Chicago. Leon looked directly at the psychologist and said with a composure that contrasted sharply with his age, "I was lying there on the ground, but I wasn't inside anymore." Dr. Brenner, trained to identify confabulations or fantasies typical of childhood, asked Leon to elaborate on his statement. The child continued, maintaining stable eye contact and a calm tone. "It was a big light, but it didn't hurt. It seemed to know me." The report proceeded with descriptions of a feeling of physical detachment, followed by an experience Leon described as crossing through something bright and warm. At one point in the narrative, Leon mentioned hearing a voice without an identifiable physical source, a voice that came from neither outside nor inside, but simply existed around him saying, "You have been here before, Doctor." Brenner recorded this sentence verbatim in her notes, underlining it twice, considering it unusual for an 8-year-old child to use such precise linguistic constructions to describe abstract experiences. However, what followed completely exceeded the scope of any case previously documented by the psychologist in her clinical practice. Leon, still with the same bewildering serenity, claimed to have remembered a previous life during the time he was unconscious. Dr. Brenner, following the non-directive interview protocol, allowed the child to proceed without interruptions. Leon said that his name in that other existence was Thomas, that he was 18 years old, and that he wore brown clothes with metal buttons. He described with unexpected sensory detail the experience of constantly marching, always walking, with heavy boots that hurt his feet. When Dr. Brenner asked directly if Leon felt fear in that life he was describing, the child answered with devastating simplicity, "Yes, everyone was afraid, but I wanted to protect my friends." The narrative continued with descriptions that combined factual precision and emotional depth in a way that was inconsistent with the patient's age. Leon spoke of the smell of wet earth that clung to the clothes even after days without rain, of the distant sound of explosions that made the ground tremble underfoot, of the feeling of cold that penetrated the bones during long nights outdoors. He described holding a rifle that weighed more than he could comfortably carry, a long and cold weapon that he carried because everyone did, not because he wanted to use it. Dr. Brenner noted that Leon carefully avoided describing direct acts of violence, consistently focusing on the sensory and emotional experiences of war. When asked what he remembered most about that time, Leon said he liked to watch the birds, even there, even in the middle of the conflict, brief moments when he could temporarily forget where he was and why he was there. The child repeatedly mentioned the intense desire to return home, a yearning he described as something that physically hurt in his chest. Dr. Brenner asked Leon, maintaining her professional posture despite the growing confusion, how that life had ended. The child was silent for approximately 15 seconds, looking at his own hands resting on the white hospital sheet, before responding with a brevity that carried palpable emotional weight. Everything went white, then I became light, and I came back. The psychologist noted that when recounting these memories, Leon showed no signs of anxiety, but a calm, almost serene acceptance, as if describing distant events that no longer carried a traumatic burden. In the following days, as Leon remained under extended hospital observation due to the unusual nature of his case, Dr. Brenner conducted additional psychological assessment sessions. During these conversations, specific details emerged that would later fuel Dr. Kübler-Ross's investigative interest. Leon drew with surprising precision for his age and lack of artistic training, a badge he allegedly saw on the uniform he wore. The drawing depicted a characteristic emblem of the British Armed Forces used in the 1942 to 1945 period, information later verified by a military historian discreetly consulted by the hospital staff. The child also described a helmet that slipped down onto his forehead, a frequent complaint among soldiers using the British Mark III model, known for its imperfect fit. In one particularly remarkable session, Leon spontaneously began to hum a rhythmic and repetitive tune, explaining that it was a song soldiers sang while marching. The tune, without lyrics but with a recognizable cadence and melodic structure, was recorded on a cassette by Dr. Brenner and later identified by a musicologist as compatible with British marching songs from World War II. The Gerber family, when extensively questioned about possible sources of Leon's exposure to military history content, consistently maintained that the child had never shown interest in war themes, had never watched war films considered unsuitable for his age, and had never owned military toys due to the parents' explicit choice to encourage artistic and academic interests. Klaus Gerber allowed investigators to fully examine his personal library, which contained mainly technical literature related to civil engineering and some works of contemporary fiction, but absolutely no material on military history or World War II. Leon's maternal grandmother, the only living relative who had experienced the war period, resided in Munich and had limited contact with her grandson due to geographic distance, meeting him only on specific family occasions, during which, according to her own statement, she carefully avoided mentioning the traumatic period of her youth. Dr. Brenner produced a 37-page psychological report, meticulously documenting the interviews with Leon, including verbatim transcriptions of his statements, analyses of his drawings, assessments of cognitive and emotional development, and extensive interviews with family members, teachers, and classmates. Her conclusion, written with the caution characteristic of scientific professionals in the face of unexplained phenomena, stated that the specific information recounted by the child could not be attributed to known prior exposure, identifiable cultural influence, or ordinary childhood fantasy based on typical developmental patterns. The report reached Dr. Kübler-Ross's hands via the international network of healthcare professionals who followed her work on near-death experiences and phenomena related to human consciousness in the moments near clinical death. Dr. Kübler-Ross, established in Chicago at that point in her career after decades of pioneering research on the dying process and the nature of consciousness, was in regular correspondence with European doctors and psychologists interested in rigorously documenting cases that defied conventional explanations. Upon receiving the Leon Gerber case, she immediately classified it as belonging to a specific category she had been investigating since the late 70s. Near-death experiences in children accompanied by detailed memories inconsistent with the patient's documented life history. The doctor dedicated weeks to the meticulous analysis of the German report, systematically comparing it with hundreds of similar cases archived in her research center. Her methodology, developed over decades of clinical work, involved searching for consistent patterns that transcended cultural, religious, or contextual differences. In Leon's case, she identified recurrent elements that were repeated in reports of near-death experiences documented worldwide. The feeling of separation between consciousness and the physical body. The perception of a light that, despite its intensity, was consistently described as non-threatening. The experience of a presence or non-verbal communication that conveyed direct knowledge, and the subsequent behavioral change characterized by increased empathy and rejection of violence. Dr. Kübler-Ross recognized patterns in Leon's report that she had found in historical texts from various spiritual traditions. The description of the light that the child knew echoed passages from the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, where consciousness after death is received by a primordial luminosity described as a mutual recognition between the observer and the observed. The voice without a physical source that said, "You have been here before," found parallels in the Kabbalistic descriptions of the Olam Haba, the world to come, where souls recognize their own eternity through direct knowledge not mediated by conventional language. The feeling of lightness after death that Leon described when reporting that everything went white and then he became light corresponded precisely to Vedic descriptions of the separation of the subtle body from the physical body during the transition known as Maranam. Dr. Kübler-Ross, always maintaining her rigorous scientific perspective, interpreted these correlations not as definitive proof of the continuity of consciousness after death, but as phenomenological data that demanded serious consideration within any theoretical framework that sought to fully understand the human experience of death and dying. She wrote in her personal notes on the case that the transcultural consistency of these elements suggested either a universal neurological structure that produced similar experiences during near-death states, or the possibility that different spiritual traditions had documented genuine aspects of a reality that transcends physical death, remaining cautious about definitive conclusions in either direction. The most baffling aspect of the Leon Gerber case, from Dr. Kübler-Ross's perspective, was not the near-death experience itself, a phenomenon she had documented in thousands of cases throughout her career, but the verifiable specificity of the military memories reported by the child. The doctor requested that Dr. Falk conduct an additional investigation into the technical details mentioned by Leon. A retired military consultant who had served during World War II was discreetly invited to examine the child's drawings and listen to the recording of the hummed tune. The consultant confirmed that the drawn badge precisely matched the emblem used by the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers between 1942 and 1945. That the described helmet was undeniably the Mark III model used by British forces in the European theater of operations during that period, and that the melody hummed by Leon was recognizable as a variation of marching songs used by British infantry units, although without specific lyrics that could identify a particular unit. Dr. Kübler-Ross was here confronted with the central dilemma of her research on near-death experiences: how to explain specific and verifiable information that the patient apparently could not have acquired through conventional means. She carefully considered the available naturalistic explanations. The first hypothesis was non-conscious prior exposure. Leon might have been briefly exposed to images, sounds, or narratives about World War II through television, adult conversations, or educational materials at school, absorbing information without conscious processing that later emerged during the altered state of consciousness triggered by the cardiorespiratory arrest. Dr. Kübler-Ross considered this explanation plausible for some elements of the report, but insufficient to explain the combination of technical precision, emotional coherence, and subsequent behavioral change. The second hypothesis involved neurological processes during cerebral anoxia. The lack of oxygen during the 1 minute and 20 seconds of cardiorespiratory arrest might have triggered disinhibited neuronal activity in the temporal lobe, a region associated with memory and narrative construction, resulting in a sophisticated confabulation that incorporated fragments of cultural information about World War II present in the European collective unconscious. This explanation, favored by neuroscientists skeptical of transcendent interpretations of near-death experiences, faced the difficulty of explaining why the confabulation generated would be so consistent, detailed, and emotionally coherent, and furthermore would produce profound and lasting behavioral changes. The third hypothesis, which Dr. Kübler-Ross considered with scientific caution but did not prematurely exclude, was that Leon had indeed accessed memories of a previous existence during the near-death state, suggesting a form of continuity of consciousness beyond the dissolution of the physical body. Dr. Kübler-Ross recognized that this third hypothesis encountered formidable epistemological obstacles within the predominant materialistic scientific paradigm, but argued that prematurely excluding unexplained phenomena contradicted the genuine spirit of scientific inquiry. In a letter she sent to Dr. Brenner in April 1983, Kübler-Ross wrote that the case of Leon represented precisely the type of anomalous evidence that, accumulated over decades of meticulous research, would eventually force an expansion of scientific models about the nature of human consciousness. She emphasized that she was not defending definitive conclusions, but advocating for a continuous, rigorous investigation, free from materialistic or spiritualistic biases that could obstruct the honest observation of the phenomena. Leon's behavioral change following the experience constituted equally significant evidence for Dr. Kübler-Ross as the verifiable details of his memories. The boy who returned from the near-death event exhibited profound and consistent alterations in his way of interacting with the world. According to psychological follow-up reports conducted in the following months, Leon developed a marked aversion to conflict situations, not only avoiding them personally, but actively mediating disputes among classmates at school with a skill that surprised experienced educators. On one occasion, documented by the teacher 3 months after the incident, Leon interrupted a fight between 2 older boys on the playground by calmly approaching them and saying that fighting only made everyone sadder, including those who thought they had won. The boys, perplexed by the composure and conviction of the smaller child, immediately ceased the conflict. The teacher noted in her report that Leon's intervention had a quality that was difficult to articulate, as if the child spoke from a deep experiential knowledge of the real consequences of violence, not merely repeating moral lessons learned from adults. Leon also developed the habit of spending long periods observing the sky in silence in the family residence's garden in the evening. When his parents asked him about this new contemplative practice, he simply replied that he liked to remember that the world was beautiful and that he was lucky to be there. Leon's mother, Miriam, reported to Dr. Brenner that this response deeply moved her, as it carried a gratitude for existence that seemed excessively mature for an 8-year-old child, as if Leon had understood something fundamental about the precious and transient value of physical life that most people took decades to internalize, if at all. Dr. Kübler-Ross included the Leon Gerber case in her later lectures and seminars on near-death experiences as a paradigmatic example of what she called spontaneous wisdom observed in children who returned from states near death. She argued that the true distinguishing feature of transformative near-death experiences was not necessarily the richness of sensory details reported about light, tunnels, or encounters with entities, elements that could possibly be explained by neurological processes, but rather the profound and lasting change in the individual's existential orientation toward life, death, and suffering. Leon exemplified this pattern perfectly. The experience had not made him anxious or traumatized, but profoundly compassionate and aware of the interconnectedness of all human suffering. The doctor observed that this specific transformation, the visceral rejection of violence combined with an enhanced capacity for empathy, occurred consistently in cases of childhood near-death experiences that included memories of previous lives marked by trauma, war, or violent death. She interpreted this pattern as suggesting that the experience, regardless of the literal truth of the reported memories, possessed a deep therapeutic value, allowing the child to integrate and heal psychic wounds that transcended his documented life history. The long-term follow-up of the Leon Gerber case, conducted through periodic correspondence between the family and Dr. Brenner, revealed that the behavioral changes persisted consistently in the following years. In adolescence, Leon showed a pronounced interest in humanitarian work and conflict resolution, participating in school programs for peaceful dispute settlement. At 18, being legally an adult and capable of making independent decisions about military service, Leon chose civilian substitute service, working for 2 years in a care facility for the elderly in Stuttgart. In a follow-up interview conducted when Leon was 23 years old, he was asked directly about his memories of the near-death experience and the events he reported as a British soldier. Leon replied that the memories had become less vivid over the years, more similar to a distant dream than clear recollections, but that the central emotional understanding remained completely intact. He said that he learned through the experience that being alive was an extraordinary privilege that should not be wasted on conflict, violence, or indifference to the suffering of others. When asked if he believed he had truly lived as a British soldier in a previous existence, Leon demonstrated a remarkable philosophical modesty, replying that he did not know with certainty what he had experienced during that 1 minute and 20 seconds of cardiorespiratory arrest, but that the experience, whatever its ultimate nature, had taught him something true about the value of life and the importance of compassion. Dr. Elizabeth Kübler-Ross catalogued the Leon Gerber case under number 214 of 1983 in her Archives of the Research Foundation on Life After Death. In her final reflections on the case, written for a restricted circle of fellow researchers, she noted that cases like Leon's challenged both rigid materialists and dogmatic spiritualists to reconsider their certainties. For materialists who dismissed near-death experiences as mere neurological epiphenomena without meaning, the case demonstrated a profound and durable behavioral change that required an explanation within any complete theoretical framework. For spiritualists who interpreted such experiences as definitive proof of reincarnation or life after death, the case served as a reminder of the need to maintain epistemological humility regarding claims of direct knowledge of transcendent realities. Dr. Kübler-Ross concluded that the highest value of cases like Leon's was not to resolve metaphysical debates about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical body, debates that would likely remain irresolvable within the methodological limits of contemporary science, but to demonstrate human capacities for transformation, healing, and expansion of compassion that deserved recognition, respect, and continuous investigation. She ended her notes on the case with an observation that summarized decades of work with dying patients and survivors of near-death experiences. When a child returns from the experience of death to ask for peace and spontaneously display compassion, we are faced with a mystery that science has a duty to investigate with all seriousness, but also with a wisdom that could fundamentally change the way human societies understand life, death, and the meaning of conscious existence.